Warning. This episode contains strong language and optimism about the future, which may be unsuitable for some listeners. Like most people, I have mixed feelings about the internet. I grew up with it, so using forums, instant messaging, and social media to build and maintain my relationships is pretty much second nature to me. I love computers, I love spending time online, and I don't know what I'd do without them. But I've also had my fair share of internet arguments, harassment, and regret about all the hours I've wasted mindlessly scrolling. As I started learning about Solarpunk and about the philosophies that inspire it, I got really interested in understanding technology on a more analytical level. Like trying to look inside what we often think of as a black box. What's happening in there? What are the elements of the design process? How are decisions being made regarding design and implementation? These are questions I think we ignore too often. Plenty of people will warn about how the internet is destroying our brains. They said the same thing about TV. There's always someone worried technology is making us dumber, less independent, degrading our moral values, or whatever. Then on the flip side, there are the tech evangelists, ready to welcome our algorithmic overlords with open arms, and a good dose of neoliberal ideology alongside. But technology isn't just good or bad, the story is more complicated. Our morals, values, and social arrangements are embedded in the design and implementation of a technology. But the extent to which that determines how a technology can be used varies a lot. Like, a nuclear warhead can pretty much only be used for one thing. But a microprocessor, equally advanced and complex, can be put to use towards a variety of ends. When trying to understand technology and how it can work for us, we're contending with degrees of freedom and constraint, with latent, unrealized potential, with hacking and repurposing. We're dealing with multiple designers throughout history, all bringing their own values and perspectives, with accidents and unintended consequences, with market competition, government policy, and balance sheets. Anyone who says technology on the whole is either good or bad isn't looking deep enough. Technology, like it or not, is part of what we do as humans. It's also necessary to provide for the lifestyles and quality of life many of us have come to expect, and we'd do well to understand technology with the goal of using it responsibly. As a solarpunk who works in tech, Andre shares my interest in these philosophical issues surrounding technology. Andre, aka HydroponicTrash on Twitter, is one of the people I've met as I get more involved in the solarpunk community online. He's a hacker, gardener, and community organizer, among other things. I was immediately drawn to his blog posts and his TikToks, where he showcases a lot of DIY projects and outlines how people can make them themselves. His stuff ranges from harvesting acorns and turning them into flour, to building an off-grid solar power system, and even a jacket designed to improve evaporative cooling for people working in hot weather. In this conversation, we dig into both sides of tech, the good and the bad. This takes us back to the 60s counterculture, which had a big influence on the early development of the internet, and to the neoliberal turn of the 70s and beyond, which played its own major role in technology today. This is Solarpunk Now, a podcast about politics, science, technology, philosophy, and whatever else it'll take to get us out of this mess. Join us, and let's demand a brighter future together.
I'm Andre. I go by HydroponicTrash on Twitter and TikTok and a whole bunch of other places. I'm a hacker, a gardener. I work in technology, but I also really love plants. And yeah, that's pretty much what I do. I write a lot of solarpunk fiction, and I kind of call myself a solarpunk. I like that term. I really like it. I think it sums up a lot of things pretty succinctly. So yeah, I'd call myself a solarpunk.
What is it about the term that appeals to you?
Really, when I stumbled on it, It was actually through Saint Drew on YouTube's video about Solarpunk.
Me too,
Um,
yeah.
and I watched it and I was like, holy shit, this is literally all the stuff that I've been interested in, kind of all separately. Because I kind of kept them all kind of like separate side hobby situations. But then it was all like a click just went off in my head. I'm like, oh my god, this is all the stuff that I like absolutely love. And there's a term for it that's just like, oh, solar punk. Like I could talk to anybody and be like, I'm into solar punk or I am a solar punk, and people would automatically understand like, oh, you're into this, this, and this. So it's a real easy kind of catch-all term for a whole bunch of different stuff. So that's kind of how I fell into solar punk, was just kind of like, oh my god, this is perfect.
Yeah, it brings together all these things I didn't realize could not only like exist in the same space but have a synergy with each other.
Yeah, like when you first think about it, you're like, okay, combining ecology with technology and social change doesn't necessarily seem like it go together, but they're all intertwined in some pretty interesting ways.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there's been kind of a cohesive idea that's come along that said all three of these things necessarily combined together. There have been things that have been like social change and ecology. Um, there's plenty of philosophies out there that have kind of like gone into that, but I think the combination of technology, humanity, and ecology, and how all those three things interconnect, is something a little bit new, especially where we're at with technology, where we're at in the process of climate change, compared to the past.
How does working in tech shape your perspective for that? Like, there's probably sort of a tension between the technology industry and where you'd like to see technology go in terms of your politics.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like, especially now, I think technology and tech companies in general are really like wrapped up in capitalism and really wrapped up in profit motives.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that to contend with, especially working in tech, you're constantly aware of the fact that like, oh, I'm working within capitalism. All of this has to revolve around profit. That this is like all of this is the exact opposite of where my social and political beliefs lie. So there is like an ethical dilemma that you run into, because on one hand you're like, I consider myself an anti-capitalist. I consider myself to have a deep love for ecology. And on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, there's the fact that by working in tech, I have to be forced to work on things that generate profit. And that's not necessarily all the time, because, you do have open source technology and stuff like that. But by and large, the tech industry is mainly driven towards profit. But in terms of like working in tech, like working in tech has really taken away like the magical black box mystery of technology, and like shown me really firsthand on like the stuff that it can do, what it can't do, what its limitations are, some of the stuff that that we think are limitations, but actually technology can really, really help us with. So I think it's interesting, especially when you're working hands-on with it, because then you see, you kind of see how the hot dogs are made, so to speak,
Yeah.
Especially like, because I work in cybersecurity, so like my job specifically is to hack computers for a living. That's all I do, is just hack computers. But with that being said, I'm less so hacking computers and more so like testing assumptions, because most of cybersecurity is testing assumptions. People will develop something, or people will build software and assume that it's secure, or assume that it's supposed to do this thing, or assume that we could put technical controls in place, and assume that computers somehow know more than humans and that like they're infallible. That's just like not the case at all.
Right. There's always a human element.
Yeah, there's always a human element, because like computers are purely logical. They work on their input and they output whatever they come up with. So if the data being put into the computer has some kind of bias behind it, the computer's just going to spit that bias back out.
Right.
Which is why stuff like artificial intelligence and machine learning sounds really cool. It's like, it's futuristic, it's sci-fi, you know what I mean? It sounds amazing to have a computer think and do things, but in reality, all machine learning really is, you know, a bunch of for loops that kind of like loop together, loop around, and then somebody has to classify the data going in and going out and telling the computer if it's right or wrong. So there is a human involved at every single step.
I really like your use of the word assumptions. Like when you implement a technology, there are certain assumptions about either the technology itself or how it's going to be used. I'm curious, in situating technology in more of a holistic environment that recognizes ecology and humanity, how should our assumptions about it change?
I think that we assume that computers are these all-knowing, knowledgeable things, but really they're just products of human logic, and they amplify human logic. So I think that our assumptions of computers as being infallible or somehow being able to like run things better than humans is really like a short-sighted and somewhat flawed way to look at things. You know what I mean? There's humans on every single front of computers and building software, so we have to test our assumptions when it comes to the benefits of technology, but also understanding that humans are a part of technology, and that humans being a part of technology means that technology is a part of ecology because humans are a part of the ecology. So how can we change technology to not cause more destruction, but also recognizing that changes in technology won't necessarily change everything? They might change some things, but it's the combination of changes in technology with social change, because I don't think that we'll have positive technological change without positive social change. And not only on that flip side, on the trifecta, we won't have positive change in either one of them if we're not having positive change with the ecology.
Right. That gets me to the term appropriate technology. You actually introduced me to that term. It seems like that's a good way of explaining how that trifecta looks in practice, like managing the social, ecological, and technological outcomes, making sure that they're working together.
Yeah, pretty much. I think like when people talk about technology, they always assume that it's going to be like high tech stuff, like computers, machine learning, AI, all that kind of sort of stuff. But I would say that technology lies on a spectrum. On one hand, you have, let's say, on one end of the spectrum, you have low tech solutions. So that might look like passive solar. That might look like things that don't require a large amount of inputs and don't require extractive practices to use. So say, for instance, like on the low-tech end of the spectrum, that might look like building Adobe homes. Building Adobe homes that are really insulated, so that way you're not relying as much on air conditioning. So that might be on that end of using very basic and simple techniques that really do actually make a kind of technological impact. And it's still technology. I mean, human beings would consider Adobe houses to be a form of technology, even though we say, oh, it's low tech. I mean, this is phenomenal that we can make homes that are extremely well insulated. In the middle, I'd say you kind of have a blend of low tech and passive technology with what I would consider to be appropriate technology. So appropriate technology would be solutions and technology that fit the environment best in that situation.
And by environment, you're including like ecology and the humans, like people living there?
Yes, exactly. So ecologies, keeping in mind the social aspect of where people are living and the geographic region too. So, as an example for appropriate technology, there are going to be things that make sense for people living in the global south that would work better for them. Say, for instance, there's somebody who's living in a rural mountainous area that doesn't have access to electricity. Say, for instance, right? If we're going to say, okay, well, we want to make these people's lives better, so let's just ship them some washing machines that run off of electricity.
Uh-huh.
It'd be like, dude, I live in the middle of the mountains. I have no electricity. How do you expect me to run this washing machine? Instead of doing that, we could say, okay, well, what makes sense for the social, the cultural, and the ecological sense for this specific environment? What's appropriate for this specific location? What's appropriate for this specific person? So instead of using an electric washing machine, what about a bike-powered one? What about running machinery off of wind or running machinery off of passive solar? Passive solar water distillers, as opposed to using something that runs off of electricity. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use technology that's appropriate for the time, the place, and the people who are going to be using it. And I think that's something that's important and kind of really overlooked, especially talking about technology in general, because people want to assume that there's a one-size-fit-all solution for every single possible thing. And there isn't. We have to listen to people, we have to understand where they're at, and we have to make sure that if we're trying to come up with a solution to anything, the solution has to make sense for that person, for the people, for the ecology, for that local community, or for the local geography.
Yeah, totally. Your example about the washing machines makes me think of Facebook and like what we'd think of as like the big tech companies, how they're just like, okay, we made this thing that works in Northern California, so now we're going to put it, in Bangladesh or whatever and assume it's going to work the same way.
Yeah, exactly. But that's kind of the short-sightedness of, I think, that's the short-sightedness of the tech industry, and I think of capitalism in general, because it sees itself as coming up with solutions based on the market, and not coming up with solutions based on people, and not coming up with solutions that are good for the planet in the long term.
So it seems like local autonomy is a really important counter to that, like decision making amongst communities, and sort of a bottom up approach.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, because ultimately what we're talking about from a bottom up approach is understanding that the people who are going to be affected by things, the people who are doing the actual work, the people who are living in a certain place, know what's best for them. That's one of the big things, and one of the big pitfalls of sort of top down or central planning is the assumption that somebody can make the decision for you. But I think that people should have the ability to decide collectively, both for themselves as on an individual level, but also collectively as a community, to say, hey, I think this would work great for us because we live in a specific situation. Why don't we all agree on something that works for us?
Yeah, like how different would social networks look if they all like spawned from the communities that use them, rather than being sort of exported along with a certain system of values and view of the environment.
Yeah, because I mean, even something as basic as a social network seems very neutral on its face, but social networks really are built and geared towards a specific mindset that's prevalent in the US. It's really US centric. And so you're kind of fit into a box of like, you're supposed to interact in this way. Social media in general is kind of like a one size fit all solution, but not every single culture is going to like fit perfectly into that box.
Right. It becomes very constraining into like a certain like transactional neoliberal view of the world. Like the ways that these companies are encouraging us to socialize follow the logics of the market, the logics of capital, and in particular the logics of, being at the imperial core, being at the center of global capitalism. I think it's interesting to think about how it's kind of enclosing our social space. It's another way that we're being kind of streamlined into capitalist realism.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that really has to do with just the simple fact that, social media companies and really I'd say most tech companies are built to produce profit. There is a profit motive behind it. So if we take Facebook as an example, Facebook's main goal seems on its surface to facilitate connections between people, between generations, between geographies. It's a place where you can go to upload pictures with your family. You could share information to people. You can reconnect with, old schoolmates. It sounds like really amazing. And people use Facebook for that. But ultimately, Facebook is an advertising platform. Facebook is there to mine data and sell that data. Regardless of what people use the actual platform for, that is the business model of Facebook. So you see that because Facebook is built to make profit off of advertising, it starts to become a market of clicks. You want more people engaged, you want more people on the platform, and so it's an attention and emotional economy to either get you to click to sell you more ads, or to get you kind of riled up and just keep clicking on the platform.
Keep doom scrolling.
Yeah, exactly. Twitter's the same way, Like Twitter has really, I think the personification of Twitter is going on there and arguing with people about the stupidest shit. Sometimes it's legitimate arguments, but other times it's like, because you're limited to the amount of stuff you can say, there's no nuance to what you're saying, so people will take you out of context. It's just a whole big thing. But again, Twitter is there for the attention economy. They're there to sell advertising space and to sell products. So the more time you spend on Twitter arguing about niche political topics of 18th century dudes from Europe, the more money that Twitter makes. So it's the same thing.
Yeah. It's kind of freaky how groups on Twitter, all like left wing groups, but they're all like consolidated into their own little niches, and Twitter just like pits them against each other. I've never felt like less solidarity with my comrades than when I'm looking through Twitter.
I know. And then the second that you meet each other in real life, it's like, yeah, we agree on all this stuff. We might, differ from some tactics, or we might differ in some ways that we might go about things. But, ultimately, we kind of all want the same thing. But, like, that's what the internet and Twitter does. It takes the face of the person you're talking to away, and then you're just kind of arguing for argument's sake.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're totally right that, like, you get together with the exact same people in person, and you might still disagree, but it doesn't get so vicious. It doesn't get like, I need to spend my whole day proving this person wrong. Like, no, you're just gonna like start planting some seeds or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna keep doing your mutual aid stuff and move on. It's not like it's not a big deal. You're not gonna kill each other over it. But online, it just definitely feels like an antagonistic, personal attack on people. But it is what it is. That's kind of like that's kind of how things work, and I think that's kind of talks about a lot about how the internet has changed from a personalized, almost like a diary, into now an algorithmically generated and algorithmically pushed kind of curated internet, because the things that you see on the internet, the things that you see using technology, are now more and more dictated by algorithms and feeding you the things that the company thinks that you will like, and you'll click on, and you'll stay on the platform and keep using them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, internet in a lot of ways started out as a very free radical space. I mean, there was this like utopian vision that everyone had a library at their fingertips. Now we're just going to share everything, free software. um I don't know if it's fair to think of it as like kind of a slowed downfall, but it does seem like it started as like a very bright open space coming out of like the counterculture of the 60s, and got, enclosed and consolidated by these platforms that popped up and found extractive ways of using the technology.
Oh man, yeah, that is a whole big thing. I think it's really interesting that the internet, and more so, computing, and then eventually interconnected networks, were really made by and for governments and military.
That's a good point.
The original interconnected computer networks were created for the military. And then over time, as the internet kind of grew, you start to see some of the utopic countercultural visions of the internet coming back and taking control away from governments and military powers, and really giving this amazing view of what the future could be.
Right. That's, a really great point. I wasn't thinking about, the fact that it did come out of DARPA, literally.
Yeah, and that's another thing. It's like, there's so much of our technology today that we think is relatively benign actually comes from military research, which I think is interesting because, tech companies tend to say that they're innovators in technology, when most of the time what they're doing is they're taking ideas from publicly funded research, chaining them together, and then selling you a product that was... Now that it's chained together and they're selling that product, they'll use intellectual property to say that, oh, we made this. When in reality, it's a bunch of stuff that some weird nerds came up with in a laboratory, and now all of a sudden I have to pay for it.
Yeah. I mean, actually innovating something entirely new is not very cost efficient. That's a big risk for a company to take on.
Yeah, exactly. Like, true innovation rarely ever comes from a profit motive, because if you're looking at a profit motive, you're looking to make as much money as possible. You're not looking to really innovate and really change something unless that change will generate profit.
Right.
But I think that there's plenty of people who will do research, who are doing these things, that don't really care about money. They do it for the fun of it. They do it because they love technology. They do it because they're curious, and they build these things because, hey, why not?
Yeah, it's just like human curiosity and ingenuity. There's no reason it has to be constrained in this very confining space that's like, very risk averse, very focused on like what's the least I can do to get the most profit.
Yeah, really. What's the least I can do to get the most profit, and how much can I exploit workers?
Right.
I think is one of the guiding goals of capitalism.
I mean, that just seems to like really run counter to the more natural instinct to just want to create and explore.
It is the exact opposite. Especially, at least to me, in my opinion, it is the exact opposite. Like, people do things not just because they're going to make a profit or because they're going to make money, but because humans in general like to do things. People over history have always done things for the sake of doing things, or done things because it's just enjoyable. It's fun to make stuff. So, why do I have to force myself to prioritize profit over having fun and making cool stuff?
Yeah, totally. That's why I find this the radical history, that utopian moment in the internet, so exciting. Because it did very much come out of these ideas developing in the 60s about like, I don't know if I could sum it up, like what if we just vibed?
What if we vibed in another realm? That's
Yeah.
literally what the internet is. Like, okay, if you really think about it, the idea of the internet, the idea of this whole thing that we have going on is just so psychedelic. Like, we have an entirely other world that we can move into, move out of, and get any information that we want to at any point in history. I could share art with somebody on the other side of the world in like a second. It's mind blowing. And when you look at some of the ideas that came out of the counterculture, they're directly mirrored in some of the early countercultural elements of the early internet. Like, there's a big group of computer scientists in Palo Alto, California, in the 60s who were taking LSD and also coming up with some of the basis of what we would see in the internet today. Which is really interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think that computer scientists would be interested in LSD or interested in psychedelics in any way, shape, or form, but they were kind of holding these utopic views of kind of bringing about a new world that was free from government interventions, that was free from the exploitation that we see in capitalism, and where people could go and really be themselves and share information and really be connected almost in an entirely other realm. And a lot of that really does sound psychedelic.
It's like this whole new realm of experience. And I guess maybe we have a tendency to think of programmers or whatever as kind of narrow minded now or not really interested in those things. But like, I mean, sitting down with this new technology and finding ways to share art and share ideas with people across the world, that's an inherently like really radical idea.
It's radical, but also almost borderline magical. Like, you think of a mage or a wizard, and you're like, yeah, this person can make things appear out of nothing. Like, that's what computers do. They make things appear out of typing on a keyboard.
Man, the first time I got a computer, I remember feeling that magic, and now I lost it. Now it's like, oh man, I gotta log into work again.
The magic has gone and been replaced with Slack notifications and the dread of logging in every single day to I don't know, to do work on the computer. It's like, no, I want this to be the fun box. I don't want this to be the work box.
Yeah. Wow. So, can we talk about a little bit about the history of the 60s? And I think we largely see it as a failure, but there is that legacy of it, that we saw in the utopian internet. How do you think we should understand the 60s in relation to where we are today?
So I think largely we think of the 60s as a failure. Mostly because now we view the 60s as just kind of like liberal decadence of middle class white kids smoking weed and doing LSD and listening to psychedelic rock. But that was just a part of it. I'm not gonna I don't think people who say that the counterculture wasn't that aren't looking at it in its entirety, because that was definitely part of it. But I think another part of the counterculture that people tend to overlook or sometimes ignore was really a combination of a bunch of different marginalized groups who were really coming together almost at the exact same time. So we have black civil rights coming up. We have feminism and women's rights movements. We have the gay liberation movement. We have, Latino worker movements. We have hippies and bikers and dropouts and the psychedelic revolution all happening at this one point in time. So I think the counterculture of the 60s is really interesting when you take away the characterization of the 60s as being, just, I don't know, hippies smoking weed and not caring about the world, and instead look at some of the radical roots of the people who really made the early counterculture. And I have an article on my Substack that kind of goes through some of the early history behind that. Because I think, in general, as with any kind of history, it tends to center on white, cis, hetero males as the protagonists and as the people who are, leading the charge of change. But when you look at, especially the counterculture, um, it was really a bunch of marginalized groups and a bunch of marginalized people who were all fighting for civil rights or all fighting for liberation at the same time that really made hippies or really made the psychedelic revolution and the 60s happen in the first place.
Yeah, it's super unfortunate that we have that sort of stereotyped view looking back at it. Like it was just, a bunch of white people dropping out from society when they were almost like just showing up because it was cool because other people were already doing it.
And I know, right? And then there's the people who are extremely dedicated to this stuff, who make this, who made it their entire life's mission to have these ideas come into fruition and have these ideas come into reality, who got pushed aside by the capitalist realism, or more so the personification of the counterculture, in quotes, and overlooking the radical traditions that really made the counterculture what it was.
Right. So it sounds like you're describing sort of the way it was co-opted by capitalism, the way that, there was this critique that sort of showed up. And I think of it as like a dialectic, but I don't know. That may not be the only way to think of it. But, there were a lot of anti-capitalist critiques that came up in the 60s and then sort of got not like straight cut off, but they got incorporated into the new modes of capitalism that we would call neoliberalism.
Yeah, exactly. So a really good example of that would be, the anti-capitalist roots of the counterculture and the ideas behind overconsumption and environmentalism that were really coming to fruition in the 60s. And you have people who even back then were realizing that the path of overconsumption, conspicuous consumption, is going to lead us into climate catastrophe. Back in the 60s, and that was even before the 70s when the environmentalist movement really kicked off. And so there's people early on who were saying, like, hey, we should be looking at humanity's impact to the ecology and how can we live more in line with nature and not focus on consumption. And so the early styles of the counterculture were really because people were reusing clothes. People were taking white shirts that might have been dingy and kind of messed up and dyeing it to make it look colorful and new. There were people who had extremely anti-capitalist sentiments and who were focused on reusing and upcycling, who were focused on, instead of consuming, producing things. And that whole kind of mixture of anti-capitalism with the bohemianism of where the early counterculture kind of came out of both San Francisco and New York, of bohemian kind of artisty, cosmopolitan people. And then you start to see kind of a specific fashion and a specific way of life and a specific look that the counterculture kind of took on because they were anti-capitalist, because they were embracing different types of cultures for the first time and opening up their ideas of what the world could be. And so then you see capitalism look at these people, and a way that capitalism tries to co-opt movements is by basically making a stereotype of people. it'll make a characterization of a group or a specific way that people look or interact, and they'll take that and make it to a commodity. So by the end of the counterculture, you didn't necessarily have to be an anti-capitalist or be an anti-war protester or be for civil rights. All you had to do was look the part. All you had to do was buy bell-bottoms and buy a tie-dye shirt, and all of a sudden you're a hippie.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't necessarily the case in the beginning, because these were people who were legitimately offering up real criticisms of capitalism, real criticisms of the current world, and saying, like, we can live it a different way, we can be weird, we can experiment. And that's really a way that capitalism took that and said, oh, well, you don't have to do that anymore. You could just buy your way into it.
Right, it became like a market demographic. It's like the progression from a really radical critique to being able to buy a flattened version of that critique as a Halloween costume.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and I mean, I'll say that, like, this method was really new. This was the first time when capital and capitalist and capitalism really had tried this method out full force. And you see the same thing happen after the counterculture with the punk movement and all of the political stuff that went behind that. It went from a countercultural movement of people who had serious political concerns into, if you buy a leather jacket and you put studs on it, you are now a punk.
I mean, they sell them with the patches like already put on them in the sweatshop.
The sweatshop punks.
Yeah.
But even during the counterculture, while the co-opting was happening, there was plenty of people who were kind of central to how the counterculture was going that were criticizing this, you know. There was a group called the Diggers in San Francisco who were kind of like a weird theater troupe of people who were doing some pretty crazy stuff. I mean, even back in the 60s, they were doing, you know, direct anarchist action in the streets of San Francisco. And now, you know, nowadays we think of that as kind of a normal thing, but back then that was just incredible to hear. And they were kind of like some of the vocal people who were saying, like, there are people coming into this who don't necessarily have any political understanding or doesn't necessarily have any kind of political goals, that are just showing up to show up.
Yeah, while, you know, in the midst of the 60s, there was already that tension between, you know, groups that were like not engaged and groups that were like, we've been here, we're actually trying to achieve something.
Yeah.
You know, like, why do we think of the 60s as like hippies smoking weed, not giving a shit, when like the Black Panthers were doing stuff?
Yeah.
Organizing, you know, like free schools, free hospitals, free meals for their communities.
Exactly. I mean, the Black Panthers were a really big inspiration to a lot of the countercultural movement. They were part of the counterculture and birthed a lot of stuff that came out of the counterculture. So, yeah, like you said, it's really weird that we have this personification of the counterculture in the 60s that really doesn't mirror at all the reality of things.
Mm-hmm. So we could see these stereotypes and this sort of like controlled, commodified narrative as part of the reason why the 60s failed. I mean, yeah, there's other way more direct stuff too, like literally assassinations and infiltrations within these groups. But I'm curious, like, whether you think it makes sense to see the 60s as a failure or maybe more as a starting point or a sign of something. How would you situate that, given what's happened since?
Me personally, I don't view the 60s, the counterculture, the psychedelic revolution, as a failure at all. I think it was the spark and the starting point of what we see today and what we'll see in the future. Because, like a lot of history, we tend to think of things as in the context of what we know now. When, like, you have to keep in mind the fact that the Black Panthers, the anti-war movement, feminists, the gay liberation movement, all these different groups that normally would be segregated into their own separate parts of society were all of a sudden coming together for the first time in American history to fight for liberation for not only themselves, but really each other, because all of the issues that intersect between all these different groups all intersected. So this was the first spark of really big revolutionary change across multiple different groups. And I wouldn't say that, like, this is the biggest, or, you know, there are plenty of things in American history where it was like a spark of revolutionary change, but I think that it was the first time where you really see intersectional change first start happening. And that's why I don't view the counterculture as a failure. I just see it as the start of something. It's not the end all of it. It's just the beginning.
The beginning of what?
I That is a good question. I really do see a new countercultural shift ahead on our horizons. I think that, especially with COVID-19, especially with the George Floyd uprising, I think there's a lot more people who all of a sudden had their world completely rocked. They had their worldview of how things should be, or how things normally would be going, and are kind of shaken to the reality of our situation. I think there are people who suffered through natural disasters who before wouldn't have thought climate change was real, but the second that you go through these things, the second that you see these events, the second that you see the world changing, is when you start to change your perspective. So I think that with all the changes that are happening, with all of the technological advances that we have now compared to the 60s, the fact that the 60s and the counterculture of the 60s birthed a lot of the political change in America, now we have a pretty broad amount of people who are politically active, and I would say who are really well informed compared to the 1960s. I think the environment is more conducive to systematic change now than it was in the 60s.
Yeah. I like the point about people are just more, like, politically engaged. It does seem like most people are paying attention in a way that maybe isn't possible if, like, television has just become a mass-produced object and there are only, like, 3 stations, and that's your media. That's how you find out about the world.
Yeah, because now it's like, you know, you find out about the world from the people who are living through it. You find out about the world through the communities who are affected directly by climate change, who are affected directly by police brutality, who are affected directly by capitalism, as opposed to back then when, yeah, you had three TV stations, magazines that were curated by people who had a vested interest in certain ideas. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. And not only that, I think that people are more politically aware because the technological landscape has changed. We have access to the internet, so now we don't have to necessarily really search very hard for answers to questions. We don't have to search really hard for ideas, because if you have a question, you can find it out almost instantly. If you want to connect with somebody, you can reach out to them.
Yeah, that utopian vision, you know, even as the space has become really enclosed and consolidated in the power of a few companies, people are still using it to connect and to learn. That's kind of the default mode.
And that's like the beauty of it, you know? Even in this kind of like capitalist hellscape, there's plenty of people who are just on these platforms because, hey, it makes it easier for me to talk to people. It makes it easier to organize. It makes it easier for me to gain more connections with people that would be impossible before the internet.
So that was part one of my conversation with Andre. We wound up having so much to talk about that I had to split it into 2 episodes. In part 2, we continue our discussion of the history of social movements and then talk about building power and strategies for organizing your community in the 21st century. Stay tuned for the closing poem, and I'll see you over in part 2. The secret of these hills was stone, and cottages of that stone made, and crumbling roads that turned on sudden hidden villages. Now over these small hills, they have built the concrete that trails black wire, pylons, those pillars bare like nude giant girls that have no secret. The valley, with its gilt and evening look, and the green chestnut of customary root, are mocked dry like the parched bed of a brook. But far above and far as sight endures, like whips of anger with lightning's danger, there runs the quick perspective of the future. This dwarfs our emerald country by its trek, so tall with prophecy, dreaming of cities where often clouds shall lean their swan-white neck. Solarpunk Now is written, hosted, and produced by me, Luca Dowell. My guest today was Andre, aka HydroponicTrash on Twitter and TikTok. You can also check out his blog at anarchosolarpunk.substack.com. The Solarpunk theme song is by Red Keener on SoundCloud. The poem was The Pylons by Steven Spender. You can follow the show on Twitter at SolarpunkCast or visit solarpunkcast.net for all episodes, including show notes. You can also visit solarpunkcast.net to donate to the show. I do all of this myself and I don't run ads, so your support is greatly appreciated. That's solarpunkcast.net, link in description. And remember, the realization of any vision requires action. I strongly encourage you to get involved with local organizations whose goals align with the brighter future you want to see. Analysis is important, but we have to back it up with practice. Keep dreaming big, and keep up the good work.